visitors from very far away. So I'm going to hand over the moment to Jiteng. Please do be aware that some people are still coming in. The door will be shut, but they might just open the door to come in. But enjoy the debate. Jiteng, over to you.
Welcome to the exhibition debate between Team Singapore and Team USA. In this debate, each team will have 3 substantive speakers and 1 reply speech. Each substantive speaker will have 8 minutes of speaking time. The bell will go off once at the first minute like this, following which speakers from the opposing team can begin offering points of information. At the 7th minute, the bell will once again go off once like this, following which speakers from the opposing team can no longer provide points of information. At the 8th minute, the bell will go off twice like this, following which speakers are supposed to wrap up their speeches as soon as possible. The bell will be rung once at the 3rd minute and twice at the 4th minute for reply speeches. Before the debate begins, audience members are reminded to turn off all mobile phones and refrain from leaving the lecture theatre as far as possible. On side proposition for today's debate, we have Team Singapore. The first speaker is Jonathan Yap. The second speaker is Ryan Wee. And the third speaker is Awe Ho. Ryan will also be delivering the reply speech. On side opposition, we have Team USA. Their first speaker is Gaurav Gawakar. Their second speaker is Aditya Dar. And their third speaker is Liz Yan. Aditya will also be delivering the reply speech. And on the motion, this House regrets globalization. I call upon the first speaker of the proposition, Jonathan Yap, to open the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, the benefits of globalization have been unfairly distributed. This is a world where the engorged wealth of the affluent have been built on the subjugation of the poor. A world where the affluent and the developed world have been accompanied by the brutal exploitation of the vulnerable. In China, where 6-year-olds are forced to work in sweatshops 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. In Nigeria, where young women and men, just like you and I, are saddled with high interest debt and are forced to work in brick mills for the rest of their lives. And the suggestion that rising tides lift all boats reeks of unchecked privilege. On team proposition, we believe that globalization has been but a game to augment the rich. It has been asymmetric in transactions. What is globalization? In principle, team proposition thinks globalization refers to the concept of eradicating poverty. In practice, this has often come about through international treaties like NAFTA. Crucially, globalization is more than just about international cooperation that would have otherwise occurred. It is about creating a world of coercive dependency, where no nation can live alone unless forced into United Nations, where the pursuit of development has occurred at an unfettered pace, stripping Africa of its resources and exploiting the laborers of East Asia. We think it has built a world founded by the rich, controlled by the powerful, and developed on the backs of the poor. And that is why, on team proposition, we regret globalization. No thank you. What is our stance? First, we regret globalization in its entirety, both as a concept and the way it has been carried out. Second, and to be clear, this is a debate about the concept of globalization, not in an ideal world, but what has already happened. This debate is crucially a retrospective evaluation of globalization that has already occurred, examining its consequence in its entirety. We have 3 arguments. First, that globalization has perpetuated inequality. Second, that has created inertia to social change. And third, that has fueled the rise in political extremism. First argument, that globalization has perpetuated inequality. The thrust of this argument is that globalization has decimated economies in both the developed world and the developing world. Let's begin from the rather intuitive premise that human nature is fundamentally driven by greed. Since the dawn of humanity, human relations have been characterized by a pursuit of self-interest above all else. Where power is a zero-sum game, individuals are often concerned about their welfare first and the welfare of others second. Crucially, globalization has provided a platform for this self-interest to take root and perpetuate itself in two unique ways. First, it has destroyed local economies in the developed world. We're talking about opening up access to cheaper labor markets in less developed countries, encouraging corporate outsourcing, such as pushing operations, factories, and employment overseas. This accounts for the fact that in the United States, Rust Belt states now reek of unemployed individuals and empty factories. Critically, the vulnerable are often the individuals who are left behind. Low-skilled laborers who are shut out of the job market. First of all, hold on a moment, sir, because the job market often changes too fast for them, but second of all, because they don't have the necessary requirements to upgrade their skills. Before I move on,
sure, you might have this belief that all humans are basically greedy and evil, but what you miss is that states are often the ones that enforce globalization. So states like China, for example, when they had globalization, they had job training programs like the Yigong Daizen training program, which ensured that their workers were able to transition to better economies, that the workers were able to have better wages, and that they were able to grow much faster than ever before.
But the problem is that often globalization is solely controlled by the levers of change that are dictated by the rich. Individuals like China, like America, who have a disproportionate economic clout and therefore able to dictate the terms of these treaties to begin with. Moving on. Therefore, we think that to this end, money has often only gone to the bankers in Washington and the politicians in Brussels. Development has often been born on the backs of the poor. Car manufacturers living in Iowa who are systemically unemployed. Individuals working in steel mills in Poland who are stuck in a cycle of systemic and structural unemployment. To this end, we think team opposition's model has perpetuated inequality in these circumstances. But second of all, it has often decimated developing countries. When the rich can now gain access to nascent markets via free trade agreements like NAFTA, we think the diamond mines in Kenya, the oil rigs in Nigeria, and the cobalt mines in Botswana have often been a game of hide and seek for the rich. Because they pursue unfettered, no thank you, economic growth that outstrips the environment. Because the logging that occurs outstrips the environment to the point these trees can't survive. Crucially, this is an endemic problem to the notion of free trade within globalization in itself, because they encourage things like localized dumping, no thank you, at the point in which we are unable to assure regulation. This is systemic to the notion of globalization because it has often been dictated by the rich. Team opposition may claim, but yes, this has often meant economic growth. We agree, but economic growth built on the backs of underage laborers working in coal mines is not a cost we are willing to accept. And note, this human cost is fundamentally significant because relative wealth matters more than absolute wealth. There are two reasons for this. First of all, because the poor people we're talking about are often trapped in cycles of irremovable poverty. They are unable to uplift themselves through their own means and are therefore stuck in debt. Second of all, is because a marginal increase in your own income matters not much at the point in which everyone else in society experiences this growth. Think about it. If everyone earns $10 more because of globalization, the utility of that additional $10 is fundamentally less valuable. The poor are still sidelined on the team opposition's model as an abhorrent consequence we're not willing to accept. No thank you. Second argument, that their model creates inertia to social change. The thrust of this argument is that their model has stagnated change in both the developing and developed world, destroying local cultures. I think we need to begin from a very intuitive premise that change is hard. Three reasons for this. First, because political will is often finite and insufficient. Poor people, mind you, are often kept out of sight and out of mind because governments have every incentive to isolate them from the mainstream, building enclaves where they are unable to get out or even enter. Crucially, this is a situation where their issues don't gain enough traction both in the public sphere and the political sphere, and that's why poor individuals today don't form a sufficient voting bloc to initiate change. Crucially, we think they're also subject to things like regulatory capture, where the poor don't dare to voice their concerns because their entire livelihoods are contingent upon these MNCs providing them some form of employment. Second of all, governments often sideline their concerns, telling them that the long-term benefits of free trade will outweigh the short-term trade-offs. No thank you. When detached bureaucrats make these decisions on your behalf, we think this explains why the rhetoric of the EU has often kept poor out of sight and out of mind in countries like Poland and Hungary. Third of all, it is because the positions of power we're talking about are fundamentally arbitrary. It was coincidental at best that in a post-Cold War era, the US was able to control institutions like the INF and the Bretton Woods. It was coincidental that we leased them this form of authority. Crucially, we think there is no reason why the West should dictate the terms of these new world orders. Given that change is often rare, we think globalization has often incurred tremendous social costs. Indigenous communities that have been devastated, often because relocation and transnational corporations are able to exploit and extract their natural resources. We're talking about American logging companies that have chopped down the Amazonian rainforest at a pace never before seen, encouraging erosion and creating displacement all over the world. These are individuals, mind you, who are systemically excluded from our political system because they form a minority and their voices are never heard. And that is why, on team proposition, because globalization will often become the second wave of colonialism, we think we ought to leave no man behind.
Thank the first speaker of the proposition for his speech. He spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds. I now call upon the first speaker of the opposition, Gaurav Dharkar, to open the case for side opposition. Thank you.
Team Proposition lost this round when they got up here and said that they are going to reject the whole of globalization. Let me offer you the far more realistic proposal of Team Opposition. Do we think that globalization is a perfect process? Not at all. But do we think that it is far better than the alternative? Absolutely. With that in mind, let's go on to how we should be defining and framing this round. We think that globalization is the processes and outcomes by which nations become increasingly interconnected in a political, economic, and social context. We think that globalization expresses itself through organizations such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, through agreements such as free trade agreements negotiated between countries. So therefore, let's move on to the framing for this round. It's far too easy for the proposition team to get up here and just go on and on about the woes of globalization. But we don't think that's what this debate is about. We think it's about the comparative. You need to evaluate a world without globalization and a world with globalization. And that is why we don't think that either team needs to wholly reject or wholly support globalization. What it comes down to is at the end of this round, we need to see whether on net globalization has helped more people than it has hurt. And I think throughout the entirety of this speech and throughout all of opposition's bench, it's going to become quite clear that it has helped far more people than it has hurt. So now, let's move on to what the proposition team brings to you as far as substantive material. Let's begin with their first substantive about how globalization perpetuates inequality. Let's begin with the fundamental assumption that this relies upon. In fact, there's a contradiction here that I think they really need to reconcile in their next speech. They say here that globalization has decimated economies across the world. But then they say that human nature means greed and the profit motive. I simply don't see how these two can be reconciled. If globalization is a way that ensures that people can make more money, how does it also decimate economies? And what they bring to you in this round is just simply false. After globalization was implemented, global GDP has risen at a breathtaking rate. In fact, the global economy performs far better as a result of globalization on a whole than it has without it. This is simply false and a contradiction that they need to evaluate. Now, let's group a couple of their arguments together because they really rely on the same fundamental assumptions. Again, let's talk about outsourcing, child labor, and environments in developing countries all together. First off, these things are not intrinsic to globalization. Force them to provide a link in their next speech or at some point during their speeches how this links to globalization. I think what they did up here, was come up here and give you a pretty comprehensive list of the problems with capitalism. Yes, when you have unrestricted capitalism, you're going to see things like outsourcing, you're going to see things like exploitations of labor markets, you're going to see things like exploitation of the environment. This is not linked to globalization. Furthermore, we see that globalization is actually the solution to all of these problems through two ways. First, it allows the middle class to grow in these countries. Let's look to China, where after the processes of globalization were implemented, the middle class grew by 94%. This has a two-pronged solution to any harms that might come from the proposition bench. First, it means that less people need to actually rely on these systems of labor, and second, it means that a greater middle class and the undercurrent of democracy will demand greater reforms from these governments. before I move on, a point of information.
What is your side's solution to uplifting the 436 million individuals living below the poverty line?
Our side's solution is to allow globalization to continue lifting people out of poverty as it has in the past. Furthermore, we are not opposed to regulating globalization. Instead of just strawmanning it and saying that it's a bad thing, we can implement policies such as regulating offshore tax havens to ensure that billions of dollars aren't just hid away in countries never put to good use. Let's move on to their second substantive about how it derails social movements. Again, this first very fundamental assumption that they draw on is that poor people are out of sight and out of mind. Yeah, you're right, Team Proposition, they are. So at the end of this round, evaluate which side is going to be better at helping these poor people, being brought to the forefront of these governments, being brought to the forefront of the international community. Again, if they want to talk about how poor people are shut out, we agree, but we think that we solve for that. Furthermore, they say that the West now controls everything in a system of globalization. So what they need to realize is that this was actually far worse before globalization was taking place. Now, after globalization has been implemented, there are institutions in place where these developing countries can express their disregard and express how they want to and can actually persecute against these developed countries. Let's look to the International Criminal Court where like Caribbean countries were actually able to demand reparations from Great Britain. Let's look to the UN that can pass resolutions. Now, let's move on to the first two substantives for the opposition bench. The first one is going to be how the economic effects of globalization affect the world. Let's first look to what does the global economy look like under globalization. We think it means free trade agreements. We think it means foreign direct investment, trade treaties, and multinational corporations operating across borders. So what does this mean for the world? Let's look at it through three different lenses. First, generally. We think that generally it has expanded the global economy to almost fantastic proportions because it has placed a greater emphasis on expanding the middle class. But let's get a little more specific. Let's go into developed countries specifically. In developed countries, this growth in their economy has allowed for specialization. And we see that countries that are able to handle this globalization properly have allowed the people in their countries to work fewer hours for greater benefits. We think that this globalization, when properly regulated, is the greatest thing that can happen to a country. Let's look to what happens in developing countries now. We see that the global reduction of poverty that has been a result of globalization affects developing countries most profoundly. We see that free trade agreements allow freedom of movement as well as freedom of economies. That means that workers are now able to move across borders, which forces governments to be more accountable and have better protection for the workers because they know that they can leave far more easily. Overall, it has enriched their economy and it has uplifted people. Let's look to the Nicaragua Canal, which employs people with far better wages than they would usually receive in their country. Let's look to the example of China, where they were able to lift 680 million people out of poverty, expand the middle class by 94%. Let's look to the example of Cuba, where completely being shut off from the United States hasn't harmed them because globalization has allowed them to cooperate with literally every other country on the face of this earth. What it boils down to is that globalization has led to a breathtaking expansion of the economy, and this expansion has uplifted all people, and we think is only going to continue to do that. Now, let's move on to the second substantive about how it has helped the political and social context in countries across the world. First, how does globalization actually bleed into the political and social sphere? We think that globalization brings governments of countries together because of this economic interconnectedness. As countries rely far more on other countries for their economy to thrive, they want to express their concerns through institutions, and these institutions we've seen have been formed. I've already given multiple examples, such as the United Nations. Now, how does this interconnectedness actually tangibly help people? We think globalization leads to human rights protections on net. The reason for this is that companies want to adhere to the international rule of law. Let's use some of the analysis that Team Proposition provided to us. Companies seek out a profit motive. Companies are motivated by greed. Fine. What globalization does is step in before the profit motive instead of after the fact and say, if you want to make money in this country, first you have to step through us. That means companies, if they want to make money in these countries, now have to adhere to an international rule of law set by a globalist policy. Furthermore, we see that the growth of the middle class has led to the undercurrent of democracy, like I've said, which has led to greater liberalization. Looking, for example, to social movements in China, which have received greater liberalization because of globalization which has empowered the middle class. And finally, we can see things such as NGOs cropping up and getting more power. For example, in Nigeria, female genital mutilation was able to have significant reforms against it because NGOs were able to empower women in that country. And finally, globalization also means expansion of the internet, which can lead to grassroots activism. What you see here is that globalization, what they give you is simply a false narrative of it. What we actually see is that globalization is a rising tide that empowers all people rather than what they say reeks of privilege.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 23 seconds. I thank the first speaker of the opposition for his speech, and now to forward the case for side proposition, I call upon Ryan Wee.
In first speaker, we told you how globalization has created vast inequality. In response to first op, they cite some very nice statistics about how globalization has uplifted the middle class. You see, the problem with these statistics is that they fail to understand what's going on the ground. There is more to economic development than your GDP. There is more to economic development because economic development is also about ensuring that it trickles down to everyone and is not kept captive by a privileged few. In that very example of China, the only cities that we have seen developing are Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou. If you live in a village along the Yellow River, if you live in other cities like Tianjin, what you are seeing is globalization taking away your jobs and leaving you behind. Because globalization is controlled by a privileged few that do not care. Given that, I'm going to look at this debate in two questions. First, has globalization worsened economic inequality? Second, has globalization benefited society and politics? First, on economic inequality, they said we had a contradiction because we can't have human nature being greedy and economies not developing because if you are greedy, you want to make money. But that very clearly shows they were not listening to what we said in first. We told you in first that the way human relations are constructed are unequal. Equality is good in principle, but it is a principle that has almost never been followed in human history because people are greedy. Crucially, what globalization does is it provides a platform for those who are already in power to exploit those who are not. So those who are in power, who are self-interested, are now able to use the interconnectedness of the world to exploit others and harm them even more. So that was a very bad response to our first substantive. We told you furthermore how they have a simplistic understanding of economic growth. They're citing examples of the new middle class and uplifting 94% of the middle class. Fails to understand that oftentimes this middle class is just a new rich, a new elite who is not and nowhere near the people on the ground. That's how we told you. In places like Nicaragua, the people who are working on these bridges are also the very same people who have been in power for a long time. Businessmen, people who are already rich and connected in merchant circles. These are not the people on the ground. And the people on the ground are the majority, the people who we have to protect in this debate. In fact, they never even dealt with the two reasons why we told you that people in the poor countries are harmed. We told you one, MNCs outsource jobs. They said, but that isn't something to do with globalization. Sweatshops exist anyway. Yes, they exist anyway, but globalization makes it so much far easier for you to do sweatshops because now it is so much easier for an MNC to outsource its jobs to India, but we can use Chinese sweatshops because globalization has allowed labor to be cheaper in these countries. So they need to respond to this in the next speaker. The second reason we told you was that the global economy is changing at such a fast rate that people aren't able to keep up. Entire industries are disappearing on the go. They need to respond to this second reason in the next speaker. If not, they lose this point. Furthermore, even if we have to concede that absolute wealth goes up a bit, what happens on the other side is that relative wealth goes down. And we told you that that's not good for the poor because even if the poor person now gets $10 more, if everyone else is getting $100 or $1,000, the value of that $10 is very, very little to that poor person. It is much better on our side. Lastly, on the point of LDCs, they say we have institutions. Yes, but that ignores the analysis of how these institutions are very biased. So for example, in the UN and the ICC, when they talk about Caribbean countries being able to demand reparations from Britain, oftentimes these reparations are often qualified by a small condition, and reparations are often small because Britain and other countries that control the ICC are able to manipulate these institutions to give a false veneer of legitimacy while continuing the exploitation. The second point of contention on society and culture. No, thank you, ma'am. So the first thing he talked about was human rights and how we can have democracy and liberalization. Now, that sounds all good, but the problem is that they fail to understand again how this is influenced on the ground. They fail to understand that when they talk about the liberalization and the spreading of human rights, what they mean is an imposition of ideals in a way that fails to consider the needs and the circumstances in individual countries. That is why, for example, in China, the very example they wanted to use, the fact that people are now speaking up has prompted the government and the Communist Party to crack down on these people and to further suppress discourse, which is why in recent days and recent weeks, it has banned countries, like it has banned websites and other platforms that dissidents use to spread their ideas. So even on the example of China, that's a very clear example that goes on our side. Furthermore, there are human rights normally mean things like in Saudi Arabia, where there's backlash from a conservative majority that isn't willing to accept these changes. That also leads to their point on grassroots activism, because oftentimes the grassroots activism that NGOs promote fails to consider what is needed on the ground and what is actually happening. You see, on our side, we don't believe in a world where we necessarily have to have developed countries imposing their will on the less developing countries. We can believe in working together, but just in a more controlled manner. That is not what they talk about, so that's our comparative. I'm now going to move on to my substantive, about how globalization fuels the rise of political extremism. This argument will prove that the speed of globalization and the way it has created vast inequality has made it far easier for political extremists to appeal to voters. But before I move on, yes?
You have 3 minutes left in your speech. Here's what you need to do. You need to evaluate what the alternative to a world with globalization is, and that's a world without globalization. You simply cannot evaluate globalization in a vacuum anymore.
Yes, sir, we believe in a world without globalization, and very simply, that means a world where we no longer have developed countries being able to utilize international organizations like the UN to continue harming less developing countries. It means that we don't believe in developed countries having MNCs that pilfer resources from less developing countries.
Sir.
These are all alternatives that we stand for, and we can stand for working together, but just not in the uncontrolled manner that they have been talking about. Moving back to my substantive. So far, a large part of this debate has focused on the impact that globalization has had in the past. This substantive is important because it brings a much wider long-term angle to this debate, and it's going to discuss how globalization has happened in a way up to today that will have devastating effects on society in the future. In fact, this argument clashes directly with a lot of what opposition says. They've said that it's okay if globalization harms a small, concentrated group of people if it brings benefits to the vast majority of society. This substantive proves that this so-called minority of people can end up changing their vote in a way that harms a large number of people in society. So even on their utilitarian metric, this argument proves that we can still win this debate. So how does globalization fuel the rise of political extremism? This is because it makes a whole group of society feel alienated and forgotten. We've already told you about how globalization creates vast inequality in terms of relative inequality, especially among poor communities. Crucially, the speed with which globalization occurs often adds to this sense of alienation. So one moment you're comfortable, you have a job and you have a family, but the next moment your entire industry is gone, and your job is gone, and you don't know what to do next. This is immensely scary for these communities who feel alienated from the benefits that opposition promises. What does this have to do with politics? Crucially, a lot of the language that opposition themselves use sounds suspiciously like what mainstream politicians tell those who are left behind and feel forgotten. Lost a job, that's okay. We help you with retraining programs that will allow you 3 or 4 years in the future to get your job back while you suffer in the meantime without a job because your industry disappeared. You see, what they tell us on the other side, and what mainstream politicians tend to do, is call these people trade-offs, numbers on a spreadsheet, people that we don't need to care about. Or worse, they don't even talk about what they need at all. This makes these communities feel forgotten and abandoned. The establishment, the mainstream politicians that were supposed to care for them, are no longer able to help them and are leaving them behind in this globalized world. This causes them to lose hope in politics because they see there's no one willing to talk about their problems. And this makes them turn to politicians, extremist politicians, who offer cheap and quick fixes, promises to fix things that look good but don't actually work when implemented in the real world. So this is Trump, for example, proposing the quick fix of renegotiating NAFTA, when failing to recognize how these extremist policies often have bad impacts on the people who depend so much on trade with places like Canada and Mexico. At the end of the day, go with proposition, because on proposition, we leave no man behind.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds. I thank the second speaker of the proposition for his speech, and now to forward the case for side opposition, I call upon Aditya Dar.
If Psy government's fear of people was actually accurate, Tata Chemical, companies like Tata Chemical, wouldn't have made life-saving devices like the Tata Swatch that cost $12 and allow the people of India to basically be free of waterborne diseases. If Proposition's fear of people was accurate, countries like France wouldn't push for regulations that benefit both developed and developing nations. If Proposition's fear of people was accurate, people that ran NGOs like the International Red Cross never would have done what they wanted to do. But what Proposition presents you in today's debate is a world where everyone's greedy, a world where everyone seeks profit. On Opposition, we come to you with a more reasonable stance, and because we're proud to stand for the betterment of society, because we're proud to stand for the betterment of people, we're proud to oppose today's motion. A couple of things in today's speech. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make two major points of clarification that we need to understand before we go any further in today's round. Then I'm going to ask you three very simple questions that deal with a rebuttal of their substantive material, and finally I'll go back onto our own substantive material. But first, let's actually ask two really quick questions. First, what is their alternative? Because in a motion that says, this House regrets globalization, they have to have some kind of alternative. There's not just a vacuum where globalization doesn't exist. Why is this important? It's important because if we show you that the alternative, that their kind of world without globalization is one that is far worse, we think that we're winning today's debate. So what does the alternative actually look like? Because they don't present you one, and instead what they come up with is this weird definition of globalization that literally takes the most harmful instances of globalization and says it applies to everyone. So when we asked them in their last speech, what does globalization look like? They basically say it looks like corporations exploiting developing countries, but that's not actually what Gaurav told you in Opposition 1, and that's what government failed to engage with. So what did Gaurav actually tell you that globalization looks like? He tells you it looks like the breaking down of political barriers, the breaking down of barriers to diplomacy, to free trade. Why is that so important? It's important because we think that basically what we're living in right now is a globalized system in both diplomacy and in economics, where literally every government relies on some form of diplomacy to connect with other countries. That's how the US and Singapore, for example, have such a close relationship. That's why we're here debating today, because our countries have a close relationship. That globalized economy, that globalized world is what facilitates debates like this. Why do we think that's important? Because what they say in Government 1 is extremely problematic. They say they want to reject globalization in its entirety. But what Gaurav reminds you in the beginning is that globalization looks like things where NGOs go into developing nations and help people out. Globalization looks like things where we form international agreements that can help developing nations. But government wants to reject all of that. Hold them to that standard. At the point where they say they want to reject globalization in its entirety, we think it's a little problematic of a statement for them to make, and in the end, we think that's what loses them the round. So let's go on to the rebuttal of their substantive material. I have three very simple questions that will basically disprove all of their material. First, how does it link to globalization? Second, how does globalization address the problems they bring up? And finally, what happens in a world without globalization? So first, let's talk about how some of their arguments literally have no relevance to globalization at all. Let's take the example of their second argument, where they say that basically change is stagnated in a globalized world. They're basically telling you the rich are controlling everything, and to that Gaurav basically says, what changes in your world? At the point where a system of globalization does not help them or does not ensure that the rich are any richer, I'll take your point in a second. At a point where globalization doesn't actually change this, as a point where globalization actually helps, and I'll talk about that in a second, but at a point where globalization doesn't shift the balance of power, we think that overall there's no actual link to globalization in their argument. Yes?
So we agree that our comparative is a world without certain international agreements. What you have to deal with is our analysis about why these agreements have allowed the privileged to exploit the disadvantaged.
Okay, so basically what you're talking about is you're talking about systems like the Bretton Woods system, which were created by Western countries and exploited developing nations. So first of all, our problem with that is we think that over time, like we're in 2017 now, we think that global agreements have radically shifted from what they were in the 1950s. So what do we think this looks like? We think this looks like the UN framework on climate change, that actually ensures that developing countries get money in order to make sure that they can deal with the problem of pollution. That's really important because what we think is that globalization has allowed developing countries to get more political power to help themselves the best. So let's talk about their inertia argument, because the problem is that globalization actually ensures that this changes. Why is this true? We tell you at the point where the middle class is able to grow, and all in response they say is that it's really relative, to the point where we say, look, At the point where the middle class expands, they like to tell you that it's just more rich people. We say 680 million people isn't a new 1%. It's not a new class of rich people. It's people actually growing, and they're able to get better jobs, and they're able to make better differences. Why is that important? We think that they're more able to push for political change, which is what we see happen. We see that when nations are more able to industrialize, they're more able to push for reforms. That's the important change that we think happens in our side of the house that their side of the house doesn't get. They have this argument about inequality, moreover, where they tell you that people are left behind by the rapid pace of globalization, but they never actually respond to the point that I asked them in the first speech, which is how countries like China, for example, provide job training programs that ensure that people aren't left behind by globalization. Look, at the end of the day, the reason government wants to win today's debate is because they want to show you this narrative that governments are evil, that people are evil, that corporations are evil, and they're all motivated by profit and greed. But at the end of the day, that's simply not true. In a world where we ensure that globalization makes sure that that governments can take care of the people, that people can take care of themselves and are better off, we think that we're winning today's debate. Finally, to go into the point about political extremism. See, the problem we have here is very simple. At the end of the day, political extremists like Donald Trump, and trust me, we know a thing or two about Donald Trump, we don't really like Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, political extremists like Donald Trump are employing the same kind of rhetoric that government is employing today. That globalization is the evil and that their side is the solution. At that point, we're not really sure how closing off your borders and closing off trade really benefits anyone. All we think is that it feeds into that kind of racist, xenophobic, political extremist narrative that Donald Trump himself applies. Now let's go into our third substantive argument about checking conflicts, and we think there are two levels of this. First is the interconnectedness of the economy, and second is the success of international cooperation. First, the interconnectedness of the economy. We think that the interconnectedness of the economy reduces the chance of conflict. Why is this true? We think that countries are rational actors that base their actions on what's best for their citizens, and as a result, they're often motivated by the economy, but they're also motivated by other considerations as well. But what does this economic interconnectedness actually look like? We think it looks very similar to India and Pakistan in 1999 to 2000, at the point where war was averted because business leaders kept signaling the government that war would essentially turn into an economic catastrophe for both nations, winning over moderates on both sides and preventing hardliners from taking charge. Why is that important? We think, first of all, it shuts out that kind of political extremism that side government seems to think that globalization creates. But moreover, we think that what it does is it actually provides a solution to decreasing conflict in the long term, which takes us to our second argument, the success of international cooperation. We think that when you break down diplomatic barriers, you increase diplomacy, and global relationships are more able to grow. Why is this important? We think it's for two reasons. First is because we think there's increased communication between states like the US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. As such, they were able to avert crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But moreover, we think it's that groups of people are able to create change. At the point where common interests ensure peace deals, we think that deals like the Iran peace deal are something that were ensured only because of the globalized world that made sure that countries had common interests, that made sure that companies had diplomatic key shared interests, and as a result, they were able to make a difference together. Side government's world is a world of the Cold War where states are still isolated. Oppositions is the way forward. That's why we oppose.
The speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. I thank the second speaker of the opposition for his speech. And now to further the case for side proposition, I call upon our Wei Ho.
You know what globalization really sounds like in the past? It sounds a lot like colonialism. Because when all these Western nations thought to themselves, wow, after the Industrial Revolution, I have a ton of technology, let me go conquer the world. It sounds a lot like the intentions of many countries we see today and what they intend to do with globalization. But in retrospect, you realize that it wasn't actually that great an idea. And funnily enough, they seem to think that the solution to every single problem that we've seen from colonialization was to do it even more, to do it one more time. The problem is, every time we see a new fascinating phenomenon or a new idea of how the world should function, we jump headstrong into it. We don't consider whether these things will benefit the world at large or not. And when we make these rash decisions every single time, we end up making the same mistakes that will leave half the world in poverty. And when we refuse to admit that what we've been doing is a problem, we refuse to solve this problem at its core. And that's what we reject on our side. I'm going to ask two important questions. First, which side removes inequality? And second, which side facilitates social change? But before that, some housekeeping issues. Firstly, on what the alternative is. The first thing I'd like to point out is that just because we regret globalization does not mean we need to regret the concept of countries working together. That's diplomacy, and diplomacy can still function. What we regret is the way globalization has functioned. As my first speaker told you, this was a retrospective motion. So they need to engage in characterization on the speed of globalization, the degree of globalization, and which countries have been affected by globalization, not just the theoretical concept and definition of it. Second of all, we did provide you a very realistic comparative. We talked about perhaps more regional organizations, more individual autonomy for countries, instead of having to join the United Nations to be a political legitimate state, as many countries are within the status quo. Perhaps you don't want standardized, imposed standards on things like the economy. We want countries to have more say in these things. These are areas that we think that a comparative can be established very clearly from the beginning of this debate. And throughout all three speakers, they've been great, they have strong making our case, and they need to engage with it at its core. So thank you. So first issue on inequality. If you've been reading up with the news, there's been this statistic that's gone viral. It is that 8 white men currently own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world. And to be clear, that's 3.5 billion people. So the opposition says that we have statistics, we have the GDP. They're forgetting a lot of people. They're forgetting the 7-year-old child who works in sweatshops in China. They're forgetting the individual underpaid Bangladeshi man who has to work for more than 12 hours every single day. They're forgetting the retrenched middle-class father in Texas whose son now has no longer a shot at college. They're forgetting all of these individuals. And what was their response? They say, we have statistics. They never gave us a real systemic reason as to why all of the problems of poverty will be solved on the outside of the house. They gave us nice sounding numbers, but not reasons why these problems will be solved. And the reason why those numbers sound good is because they don't consider other things like the Gini coefficient, which looks at how inequality spread across many people rather than the overall GDP of the country as a whole. They say we improve the middle class. Here's the problem. When the middle class enters the upper middle class, for instance, they often want to delineate themselves from the poor. So this safeguards the access to more richness that they have. Now they've entered a new income bracket. So often it isn't true that just because we benefit the middle class, that the poorest people benefit in the process as well. Often we want to be ignored by the middle class. So thank you. Second of all, even if the middle class does gain more money, do they have enough money to make social and political change? What we told you was that power was limited in the hands of the rich and in the elite. For you to make political change, you can't just be a middle-class man. You need to be quite rich. You need to be able to do things like run for parliament. And in those cases, only rich people have such power. Furthermore, we told you that the power when it comes to things like financial institutions are limited to rich countries as well. There was no response to this. We told you how institutions like the IMF are dictated by the United States because they have veto power when they have so much votes in these countries because they have say over how these institutions function. And the IMF has literally caused the Latin American debt crisis that we see today. This is not something that we should stand for at all. I'll take you a moment. In fact, go ahead.
Do you support abolishing these organizations like the IMF and like the United Nations?
If these organizations have caused more harm as we've proven, perhaps we would. In fact, we are very willing to stand for that. We stand for more regional organizations like perhaps the EU on a smaller scale, ASEAN or the African Union, where you have more autonomy to that regard, if you want some kind of diplomacy. Second, no response to all the systemic reasons why poor people don't get uplifted on their side. Firstly, because it's easy, it's convenient for governments to ignore them, no response. Second, because of regulatory capture. Often what happens is that they make poor people dependent on MNCs. They make them dependent on the developed world for their jobs. So poor people will never come out and say, I want to defend my rights. So globalization has created a system where the poor are afraid to stand up for their rights because they made them dependent on globalization for economic upliftment to begin with. When in the comparative, there would have been a successful alternative had they not been dependent on globalization. The last thing they say is, but if we have many people being lifted out of the poverty line, if you start at a really low level of what the poverty line is, sure, maybe you get some people. But the important thing here is what the relative effect of this is. Even if everybody gets $10 more, if everyone else in this room apart from me gets an additional $30, I'm in a worse off position because my $10 buys me much less compared to what everyone else in this room can buy. So even if everyone gets absolute wealth increase, the relative inequality worsens and the poorest of the poor are in a worse position in society. So thank you. Second question on social change. I'd like to first point out that many of the problems within the economy also means that social change does not get improved as well because of these structures that I've already mentioned. But what did we hear from their team? First, they say, we're the same as Trump. No, we aren't. We're taking a more cautious stance as to what globalization has done, and we're informing people on a very logical basis that globalization has caused more harm. We're not using illogical rhetoric. The second thing we heard was that we allow for close relationship between countries. First of all, diplomacy kind of still does exist, so countries can work with each other, but a positive close relationship is at best luck on the other side of the house. In fact, we think it's more likely that these close relationships were forced upon countries, where I am seen to need to have a close relationship with either the United States or China for me to survive in this world. So it's not true at all that this close relationship between countries was something that was genuine or necessarily beneficial to both parties, rather than one that was forced upon them at the end of the day. They say, but developing countries have more power than the UN. That's false. When the Permanent Five States veto power in the Security Council, when many of these nations need to choose between the US and China, I don't think they have more power in this world as well. But here's a lot of the problem of the social movements they haven't identified. A lot of them fall under the bracket of selectivism, where individuals are aware of the problems, they spread Facebook posts about these problems, but whether they make actual change is something that's very rare. And that's the problem that we haven't seen from their side. They can name me a lot of social movements, but as to how successful these social movements are, we haven't heard concrete analysis on this. The only example was some mention about NGOs. Here's the problem. NGOs can exist on our side without globalization. What globalization has done is allowed for an excess number of NGOs. The problem with excess NGOs in the world is that they do a lot of things which are useless, such as sending winter clothes to Typhoon Haiyan, or making individuals who are shoemakers in the developing world completely bankrupt from their industries because they provide useless things in these economies. It's for all of these reasons that globalization has only left more people behind. We are proud to stand in opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech, and now to forward the case for side opposition, I call upon Liz Young.
Team Government loses today's debate in first proposition when they tell you that they're going to reject globalization, quote, in its entirety. Hold them to this standard. This means they have to reject Jordan's ability through free trade to decrease its unemployment by 35%. They have to reject, in its entirety, Nigeria's ability for those women to unite with NGOs and ban female genital mutilation. They have to reject, in its entirety, the processes by which these countries become more interconnected and develop in this world. Don't let the third speaker give you a very conveniently worded answer to my POI, where I ask him a yes or no question. Do you support the abolition of the UN and the IMF? Maybe if it feels good, it's not a viable political strategy, a world in which this is actually the only way that some developing nations are able to get recourse and make up for histories of colonialism. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to ask, what is best for the economy in terms of globalization?
Secondly, I'm going to address the issue of social and political change.
What do you
And
create
finally,
that?
I'm going to talk about security, which went completely unresponded in the last speech. But firstly, let me clear up two things. It's kind of ridiculous that in the third opposition speech, we don't still have a clear conception of what their world looks like. In the first speech, they say that we're going to reject globalization in its entirety. But then we hear that somehow in the last speech, we're not going to reject things like diplomacy. But the point at which diplomacy, international treaties, is inextricably linked with nations' and ability to actually work together and globalize, we say that that is a counterfactual way to approach the concept of globalization. But moreover, what they tell you, and this is the biggest issue and why they're going to lose today's debate, is because they refuse to engage with the comparative. Gaurav and Aditya both do a really good job. They have to say, what does a world without globalization look like? They can't simply say, well, it's one without globalization. Of course that's what it looks like, but explain what that is. We think it's a Cold War era where politics are driven by fear that leads to things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that when they say that even if Trinidad and Tobago can lobby in courts, reparations are small, the comparative is that reparations are nothing in their side of the house because these nations don't have the political capital and the power to even rally together in the first place to come together through globalization. First question, economy, but sure.
Don't you think it's a tad bit ironic you accuse our side of having no alternative, yet on your side choose to premise a lot of your benefits on a hypothetically reformed globalized world?
So I don't think the fact that we've given you countless examples like Jordan, like Nigeria, like Trinidad and Tobago is a hypothetical scenario in our side of the house. Like the point at which in each speech you simply assert that globalization means the domination of privileged nations, but we tell you time and time again examples in which this is not true. I think you're the one that's ironically refusing to engage with us. Let's talk about economic globalization. And here's the key assumption on their side of the house that Aditya and Gaurav both bring up that they don't engage with. This idea, and their biggest argument under this, is the idea that people are relegated to low-paying jobs that put them in horrible positions. But in their side of the house, a world without globalization, it relegates them to low-paying jobs in the primary sector. The key thing is a world with globalization. We see that corporations are able to come into these nations, that people are being lifted out of primary sector jobs and into the secondary sector with globalization, which puts more money into their pocket and allows the middle class to grow. They refuse to engage with this. It doesn't mean a world in which people are relegated to subsistence agriculture, or a world in which people are relegated to simply not being able to engage. This is why, for example, the two most globalized countries in Latin America have a higher GDP than all of the other countries combined. It's because their jobs aren't solely in the primary sector. But even if we see that some of these problems are going to have increased things like outsourcing, that's not something that we're just going to not regulate against. Like Team Opposition isn't advocating for some libertarian utopia in which we just allow capitalism to do whatever it wants. No, capitalism is not intrinsically bad, but if we can regulate and improve it, we see things like countries being able to actualize. Listen, they don't actually point out to intrinsic harms of globalization. They only point out negative externalities, which, mind you, are way worse in a world in which the developing world is relegated to primary sector growth, which is not as good. Let's talk about social change now. And what they tell you is essentially this idea that local cultures are shut out and the developing world can't access things like organizations. We think this is rather funny. A world in which, for example, the African Union actually negotiated in the UN FWCC, which is about climate change, for more compensation on their side of the house. Something that would have never happened without a world without regulation. A world in which NGOs in Africa actually go in and back female heads of villages to eliminate things like child labor. A world in which microfinance loans are given to women in Brazil and given to women in Africa to allow these women to actually empower themselves. To say that they reject that in its entirety is patronizing at best. And additionally, they try to give you this argument about the environment, but really, we say the only reason why China was actually able to come to the table at the Paris Climate Conference is because they were more interconnected with the rest of the world. It's because they had benefits tied into countries like the United States, like these other developed nations. We see that these things only happen in a world in which they are globalized and interconnected. But finally, let's talk about this idea about conflicts and security, which rather conveniently gets no response on their side of the house. Sure.
Nigeria has a very decent shot at developing on their own, even without assistance. What China has done is to place a cap on it to make it dependent upon them for the rest of their economic future.
Okay, so one, it would have been great if you had brought that up in like not the 6th minute of the Op3 speech. But secondly, what we're going to tell you is that even if China is present in some of these areas, you have to prove that China is completely destroying and eliminating these countries' ability to grow at all. It's too late for you to do that at this point in the debate, but we can also show you that NGOs and the involvement of these other nations in places like Africa will also prove to be a net benefit. But let's talk about conflicts and security. They completely ignored the analysis in our entire third argument about what Aditya brings you in his last speech. He talks to you about how globalization means mutually assured destruction, how the reason why we don't have to worry about nuclear war, for example, is because we have things like the SALT agreement, like START, which things with Russia, which are historic steps towards nuclear proliferation and historic steps towards arms control, which are impossible in a world in which we are driven by fear-based politics and fear-mongering, such as the rhetoric we hear on that side of the House. We don't see things like the Iran deal, another unprecedented step towards integrating other parts of the world when they have $300 billion in purchasing power in their economy, when they have the strongest currency in the Middle East. That's not something that we see without globalization. Our world is safer today because of it. Look, today's debate is very simple. They cannot simply stand up here and say that they reject globalization in its entirety, except for the parts that sound good for them. We've been extremely consistent in today's side of the House. We've proved to you why globalization has been a rising tide that does lift all boats, and how all of their harms are not intrinsic to globalization and are much worse on their side of the House, a world in which nations are not held accountable to each other through interconnectedness. Thank you. Please be present.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 44 seconds. I thank the third opposition speaker for her speech, and to wrap up the case for side opposition, I call upon Aditya Dar.
The narrative that we've heard from side government is very clear. They fear a resurgence of colonialism, and guess what? That's not what we're advocating, because we fear that too. So here's the problem. Their solution, their world, defames any institution that can actually help, and any international agreement that stands a chance of removing those legacies of colonialism. Their world returns the world to an order that perpetuated this colonialist world, an order that colonialism thrived in. But we, on the other hand, reject it. It's because we think that the only way for these states to succeed is through the world of globalization we're so proud to oppose. Two things in today's debate. I'm going to contextualize and clarify a couple things, and then I'm going to ask two very simple questions. Which side best helps developing states, and simply, which side best helps the people? But first, let's clarify today's debate, because what Liz said is extremely important. Don't let proposition come up here in the reply and say we're not trying to attack all of globalization, we're only trying to attack its implementation, when in the first government speech they told you we're here to oppose the entirety of globalization. Their narrative can't shift throughout today's debate and then end where they want it to be because it's convenient for them. We think that's problematic. Don't let it happen in the reply. So what does globalization actually look like? We have been consistent in the definition that we've given you since Opposition 1. We think that globalization is the breaking down of barriers to economic and bilateral trade relationships. We think that globalization is the case where you allow institutions like NGOs and IGOs to go into countries and actually help people. Their response is by saying, no, globalization is where you allow NGOs to go in too quickly. First of all, we think it's kind of ridiculous to say that there can be too many NGOs. We think that NGOs always have a place in society. We think NGOs serve a valuable function, but moreover, we think it's very clear. Globalization is the world that we are proposing, and side government said they'd attack all of it, but we still haven't seen that in today's debate. So two questions in today's debate. First, which side best helps developing states? And let's go through this very clearly. First, we think that our side best helps developing states and helps all other states because it decreases conflict. No engagement from side government. Why is this actually important? What Liz tells you in the 3 and what I tell you in the 2 is that when you have a more interconnected economy, when you have more interconnected states, the likelihood of going to war decreases. We see that it's true in the case of the United States and Russia, when they have treaties like the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. We see that it's true in the cases of India and Pakistan, where they don't go to war because both of their countries' businesses are telling them that your economies are going to collapse. We think that's important because basically what we're doing on side opposition is we're ensuring that globalization makes sure that we reduce the likelihood of going to war, that we protect more people by ensuring peace. Moreover, we think that side opposition best helps growing economies. They bring up the example of the IMF, and the reason it's problematic is because the International Monetary Fund also does a huge job supporting developing states like Tunisia, which are allowed to restructure its debt. It looked at their example of the Latin American debt crisis and understand that in a world without the IMF, that debt crisis happens sooner, balloons faster, and prevents countries from restructuring. Finally, let's go to the idea of international agreements, because really what side government is telling you in today's debate is that they think that we should basically disengage from international agreements because they're too biased. The problem is we think they ignore a lot of the international agreements that have grown from globalization, like the African Union, which is specifically designed to help developing states. Now that we've cleared that up, let's ask the final question in today's debate. Who best helps people? And we think it's side opposition for two reasons. First is because we think we protect rights, and we think this is true in a world where side opposition is the one that ensures that NGOs can, for example, go into countries and ensure internet activism, can go into countries and ensure that in places like Nigeria, female genital mutilation is banned. But moreover, we think it's also opposition because they best reduce inequality. Look, at the point where the only reason that government gives you is this idea that corporations create wage slavery, but in their world, in a world without globalization, a world without corporations, we think that people have no alternative to move up. We think that people have no alternative to actually progress in society. We think that side opposition's world is one that creates a fundamentally better one for the people and for developing states, and that's where we're proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I thank the opposition reply speaker for his speech, and to wrap the case for side opposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Ryan Reed.
I'm going to take you through two worlds. And in spite of what they tried to say in opposition reply, their world was really a neo-colonialist world. You see, in the past, we had colonizers like Britain and France come to our lands in ships and boats. Today, the rich have gotten smarter. Today, the rich don't use these methods of oppression. Today, what they use are things like international organizations that supposedly provide equality, but in essence provide a false veneer of legitimacy where developed countries are able to oppress others. What they use are MNCs that destroy entire industries, not caring about rebuilding them at all, not caring about the retraining they wanted to talk about, just so we can have cheaper products for a small minority. You see, on their side, their world was a world that created vast amounts of inequality. And they failed to deal with the systemic reasons we gave you as to why this is what their world looks like. We give you 3 reasons. First, that institutions don't work. No response instead of asserting that they work because the UN and the African Union can't provide equality. We told you that that doesn't happen. Second, because MNCs outsource jobs. Again, no response. Third, because industries disappear so fast that there is no way to adapt to them. We told you about China, the very country we wanted to talk about in terms of retraining programs, is an example of how bad their world is. Because it is a country where a certain number of cities like Shanghai and Beijing are able to look nicer on the outside, but everywhere else, people are being plunged into poverty. You see, it was a world that relied on statistics. They tried to cite so many statistics about how we have uplifted certain people and we've uplifted the middle class. But we can cite statistics too. We can cite statistics that show that the world's wealth is owned by such a small number of people who dominate the global economy. But you see, the way to win this debate is not to cite statistics. The way is to provide systemic reasons. And that's what we did, but they did not. We provided systemic reasons about why our conception of the world is much more likely. You see, it was a world that admitted in third that there was something wrong because they said, and they introduced a new policy in third. We have regulation of MNCs to ensure they don't harm these less developed countries. So what does this regulation actually look like? Presumably it looks like preventing these MNCs from going into these less developed countries, which sounds suspiciously like a rejection of globalization. So somewhere in third, they decided that globalization didn't really sound that nice after all, and that conceded to the vast majority of our case. You see, it was a world where we had more NGOs, but these NGOs weren't actually very useful. In third prop, we gave you a very clear response. We told you about how after Typhoon Haiyan, we had NGOs, because of the excessive number of NGOs, sending in winter clothes that people didn't need. And because they sent in so many winter clothes, the local people had to hire workers to sort through these clothes, wasting time and money. We told you it's a world where we have NGOs that send boxes of Nike shoes to less developed countries just because they can, putting local shoemakers out of business. We told you that in third, no response in third order. Finally, we told you that their world was a world of backlash. We told you about how female genital mutilation that they talk about in Nigeria only creates backlash amongst conservative majorities who aren't willing to accept this. No response. You see, our world was much better because we do reject the consequences of globalization in its entirety, and we do agree with what they said about how we have to reject it entirely. But what we do not do is reject concepts like diplomacy, concepts like being able to work with each other. Because if the world we have to stand for is a world where no country knows any other country exists, that's an unreasonable burden. Even before the invention of things like the internet, countries did know that each other existed. And that's the world we stood for. A world maybe with regional organizations instead of the IMF. A world maybe where we have a lot more barriers to trade. But that doesn't mean that we have to live apart and separate from each other. You see, it was a world that did understand that certain amount of cooperation is good, but not to the extent that globalization has created. Because very clearly in first, we told you how globalization is not just mere change. It is change that has happened so fast and to such a degree that it is unacceptable. At the end of the day, go with proposition, because we leave no man behind.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 9 seconds. So I thank both sides for this debate, as well as the audience members for being such a good and great audience. So because this is an exhibition debate, we will not be giving a verdict, but all the debate members will be staying around here. Feel free to come on and ask any questions you may have. Thank you very much.